Well, I don't know if you've ever wondered how a criminal defense attorney might defend the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin, but if you've ever wondered that, you're in luck. I'll be right back. Gracious Gang, welcome. It's Mike from thegraciousguest.org here with another episode of The Gracious Guest Show. And this one happens to be another Shroud of Turin related interview, so buckle up. It's going to be a fun ride. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please make sure you do that. Like this content, share it far and wide. It really helps the channel grow, helps get this content out there to people who are interested, in this case, in the Shroud of Turin, and also this intersection of faith and reason. How can we think reasonably? How can we employ the scientific method, in this case, but also what role does faith play in that? Is this something, can we ever really live a full human life being just rationalistic creatures, and not employing some kind of faith or trust? By the same token, can we really live an authentic, fully human life by just believing the way I think a lot of people think people of faith believe, namely without any reason to believe, that it's just a personal decision, to cling to something that there's not really any good evidence for. And I think it's important for us to find that balance, and we get into that in this interview. So let me jump in here quick to introduce our guest. Her name is Theodora Pappas, otherwise known as Teddi to her friends. And I'm not going to read the whole description here, but we have information in the show notes below for you if you want to learn more about Teddi. But Teddi is a criminal defense attorney who's been practicing law since 1994. For most of the time, she's been a solo practitioner. Her practice has extended to the general sessions courts as well as trial courts and appellate courts. And Teddi has also had a growing interest since her teen years in the Shroud of Turin. And so she, of course, brings her own unique sort of examination criteria and her own sort of professional approach from this sort of courtroom legal defense kind of approach to questions of the shroud, its authenticity. She weighs different arguments, looks at this, sort of from a evidentiary standpoint, which is very intriguing. She's now also on the board of SignFromGod, and so all the other information you can see below. She's also, as of October 2022, she founded the Round Table for the Holy Shroud, or otherwise known as RHS, which is an international team of shroud scholars who have roundtable discussions to discuss various shroud issues, which they are not only investigating through research, but also investigating through the performance of various tests and scientific experiments. So without further ado, let's just jump right into this really awesome and intriguing interview where I got to sit down here with Teddi Pappas, who joins the Gracious Guest Show right now. Check it out. All right, so Teddi Pappas, thank you so much for coming on the Gracious Guest Show here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, and I was just saying to you before we started recording, it's so exciting. I don't exclusively do basically shroud content on my channel, but it's by far the most popular content I post. Really seems interesting to a lot of folks, and it really interests me that I get to on this sort of platform, be able to have these conversations with folks in different walks of life, different career paths, all kinds of sometimes unexpected, nooks and crannies of just the world that have all intersected here with this whole, Shroud of Turin phenomena. So why don't you maybe just tell us a little bit about your own background and your own experience with the Shroud of Turin?
Sure. Well, I first learned about it when I was around 15 years of age. I'm Greek Orthodox, but I had never heard about it in the church. I discovered it just through television. It was around Easter time. I saw something on the news, just some little blurb about it. And the next day I was at the grocery store with my mother and I saw a magazine cover that had the shroud on it. And so I was looking at it and I was immediately fascinated by it. And I asked her if she would take me to a bookstore so that I could get a book about it. And my first book about it was called The Verdict on the Shroud by Dr. Kenneth Stevenson and Dr. Gary Habermas. And that had a really profound influence on me my whole life. And so over the years, intermittently, I would have some deep dives of research, 1 week of intense research or a couple of days and here and there. But I mean, I've not studied the Shroud on a continuous. I mean, there are people that have studied it, on a regular basis for 20 to 40 years.
Right.
I have not done that, but what I have done is for about the past 2.5 years, I have been studying it very intensely, and especially in some particular areas that interest me the most. And I find that a lot of times these deep dives can cause you to learn information that sometimes either experts might not particularly pick up on, just because, for example, with doctors, I've had situations with doctors where, they're an expert in this. They're an MD, but they're also, a particular expert. Yet sometimes, because of research that I will do, and I mean research by looking at other medical journal articles, not,
right,
blogs, by non-experts. But I sometimes will, because I'm honing in on a particular issue and really doing a deep dive with my research, sometimes I will know things that these doctors didn't. And it's not because I'm smarter than them. It's just that they're not doing an intense focus on a particular issue. And so
you pick up on something that they didn't see maybe. Or,
And so one of the pet peeves that I have, that I hear a lot among many Shroud scholars and other people, is, you should always just stay in your area of expertise. Now, I get the general point behind that. And as a lawyer, I have had, for example, clients in prison, who have a jailhouse lawyer who, of course, did not go to law school, giving them advice, and they'll send me lots of cases to read, thinking it's going to help them. And of course, I'm kind of duty bound to read them, because what happens if there is something good there? I can't just, say, So, and a lot of times they are missing the mark on something. It's like, it's kind of close, but no cigar. And they're missing the mark on something. And so I can appreciate how sometimes, if you're not an expert and if you're not trained in a particular area, you might miss the mark. But I would argue that one other factor with these jailhouse lawyers is that most of them don't have, a college education. Most of them are, a high school education at most, or a GED. And so perhaps their critical thinking skills at parsing out information isn't quite as honed. But that doesn't mean,
or they don't have that technical level of,
but that doesn't mean that someone who's college educated, who applies themselves and puts in the time. For example, I was pre-law in college, and, government major, history minor. But as part of my liberal arts education, I was forced to take science classes. So I had to have quite a few hours of science just to give me, and look at that, how well that worked out. They wanted us to have a good enough background so that if we needed to learn something, we had enough background to where, if we put in the effort, we can figure things out. So, with a year of chemistry in high school, a year of chemistry in college, taking zoology in college, a year's worth of zoology, taking physical anthropology. I've got enough background information to where, when I read a lot of these scientific papers, sure, there's a lot of stuff that I have to look up. And then in looking it up, I then have to do further research to make sure I understand it. But if you put in the effort, you can learn it. Because one of the cop-outs that I hear a lot from people is, I just, I can't do the chemistry stuff. I'm not a chemist. I'm not a scientist. Well, neither am I. But, but I put in the effort. If I'm really interested in something, I'm going to put in the effort to learn. And so, you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to be college educated. You just have to apply yourself and use critical thinking skills.
Well, and so with that being said, so the broad sort of uh, interest in sort of that ability to maybe look at it from a couple different angles, or many different angles, obviously bringing you up to speed in these different areas in a relatively short amount of time. Like you said, about 2.5 years, I think you said.
Of really intense. I was a very knowledgeable amateur before, but now I'm,
You're really
I'm
committed
very
to digging
into it.
Well, and so what in particular, though, by the same token, in your expertise, with from the legal side of the house here, because when I was first sort of when you were recommended to me, or to reach out to you and chat with you, I was really intrigued by this idea of trying to get a better sense of how to, and maybe how not to, argue for the shroud's authenticity. Because, for example, I mean, I think that's just a good rule of thumb pretty much in any aspect of life, with me, for example, as in my case, Catholic high school theology teacher, primarily, day to day, but in other ministry work I do, I have many times started to attempt to make a particular argument for something I believed in and still do, but the way I argued it wasn't, wasn't the way to do it, or at least not that time, with that particular student, or, a friend of mine bringing up, some issue, and I misjudge because I jump in, inserting myself into it before I really hear them out, because I'm eager to sort of respond. And then it turns out that they were coming at it from a totally different angle, so just with some of those things in mind, how did you in particular, or maybe what are some things that you've kind of discovered along the way from that more specific kind of legal argumentation standpoint, that might be some good lines of evidence and some ones that aren't so good, maybe?
Well, so the first thing is that, generally speaking, the person who makes the claim has the burden of proof. And so when you make a claim that the Shroud of Turin is authentic, then you bear the burden of proof of that. If you make the claim that the Shroud of Turin is a fake, you bear the burden of proof on that. And once you establish what we call a prima facie case, and that's Latin for, kind of at first glance when you look at a case, looking at the evidence in more of a broad macroscopic way, it's where you provide enough proof to satisfy what is needed in terms of the argument to convince somebody, that they should think that something is true. But no, then there's going to be, that's not enough. I mean, a prima facie case, that's the starting point.
Right.
But now, once you establish that prima facie case with kind of the basics of the argument laid out and evidence supporting it, then the burden of proof shifts to your opponent to respond to that. Now, I'll tell you something that people forget about a lot, and I see it and it bugs me. The importance of refuting or rebutting arguments, because in debates as well as in a courtroom, there's usually this implicit understanding that I think we all kind of understand, is that when somebody makes an argument and it's not responded to, that means that either you agree with it or you don't have a good response to it. Now, that doesn't mean that a response doesn't exist, but you lose on that point if you cannot have a rebuttal to that, an argument to refute and a rejoinder. So it's important to respond to things and not just kind of turn a blind eye to when opponents make an attack, unless it's something that is just so over the top, like, they start bringing aliens into the mix, or the moon is made of green cheese. Unless they start just saying just crazy things like that, you really need to respond to it. Now, so you've got the prima facie case. The person who's making the claim establishes that. Once they do that, and if they can do that, then the burden of proof shifts to the opponent. Now, the opponent needs to respond and to attack what, the person, everything that they said. And if they can't, well, they kind of lose points, so to speak, on that. But then if and when they do respond, then, the burden of proof shifts back. And so there's this constant back and forth. Yeah. So, but one of the important things too with the shroud that people almost always forget, and I want to remind people about this. When you look at the evidence for the shroud, skeptics will try to ad hoc away arguments like, oh, well, here's one little problem or potential problem with your argument. So instead of your argument being 99% solid, it's 98%.
Yeah.
And they'll try to lampoon an argument. Now, just because there's a little prick in an argument doesn't necessarily mean that a whole argument falls apart. Mm-hmm. And the reason why is because people oftentimes put this ridiculous expectation that anything can be proven to 100% certainty. And that's false, because there's only one thing that can be proven to a 100% certainty, and that is consciousness. What Rene Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. That is the one thing that we can know with 100% certainty, and everything else, all of science and all of those things are not 100% certain, and science especially is not 100%. I know I'm big on science, don't get me wrong, but look at all the changes of opinions. Look how even with current research you can have experts disagreeing on a particular issue. So much of science is based on studies. Well, studies might be based on 2,000 people, 5,000 people.
Right.
And they make decisions based on that. How many times do we go back and forth on whether it's healthy to eat eggs, once a week, 3 times a week, 7 days a week? That's all science, but
I can't recommend it to the audience because of the adult language in it. But Lewis Black had a particularly hilarious bit about that years ago, about the eggs. It's just, would someone tell me what,
I mean, and so, so nothing is certain. So just because somebody can lampoon your evidence with just a little bitty thing, that doesn't mean it all falls down. And every piece of evidence, I think, I haven't come across anything that just has that 100% certainty to it. There's always going to be something, and especially with shroud evidence, but really with everything, there's always going to be something that a skeptic can, needle at. What you have to do,
would you say, can I just ask real quick? So would you say that trust at the end of the day is going, well, not only is going to have to, but that trust just sort of fundamentally comes into it at some point, whether you're in the courtroom? I mean, like, you can have the best case in the world, but at the end of the day, that jury has to weigh the evidence and has to weigh the arguments.
Very good.
It's they hopefully get it right. And we are using reason, that reason is very important, but we're not angels, we're not strictly rational and even a lot of the angels messed up and fell. So it's just pure reason itself. Like, it's not a math problem. It's not whenever we're talking about, attempting to uncover some sort of mystery, get to the bottom of anything, I feel like that humans are involved in. Would you say that trust then is always going to somehow come into this at some point?
Actually, thanks for reminding me about that point, because that's something that I have brought up before.
Okay.
And that is trust in terms of how provable is science. And I've even said, as a lawyer, I can decimate a lot of experts just by saying, if people want to play that game by putting all these, oh, well, did your people do this, do that? Show me anywhere in science where anybody's experiment, okay, they tell us, the COVID vaccines or whatever. And I believe in vaccines, but my point is just that we have to place quite a bit of trust in the scientists. Do we have, but let's just take just any medicine. Do we have videotape with, and not just videotape, because that can be faked. We got deep fakes. Somebody can, show that, oh, here's my container of hydrochloric acid. Well, how do we know that's really hydrochloric acid in there? I mean, that's
every
what I'm
time
saying.
I take Dayquil.
As a lawyer, I can, and other people too, you don't have to be a lawyer, but we can ask enough questions to where everything will start to collapse. It's like, how do you know? Okay, so, if it's videotaped, do we have a tester? How do we know the tester wasn't bribed? How do we know the tester's telling the truth? So at some point, you do have to figure out who you trust and who you trust, they're going to be trusting other people. And there is an element of trust with science, as much as the scientists will say, I don't know, there is. Because how do I know that your experiment, is it all on videotape from start to finish? And like I said, did you do all of these other things? How do I know people aren't lying? How do I know this isn't just a big hoax?
You could really freeze just in life in general if you have a truly rationalistic attitude.
So you have to have a certain amount of, you have to figure out, who do you think is trustworthy?
Yeah.
And of course, do your research, do your due diligence. But once you think that someone's trustworthy, that doesn't mean that you then just blindly listen to whatever they say. Constantly fact check and do your own research and see whether a lot of other people that you think are trustworthy come to the same conclusion. But so with the Shroud, you've got a ton of scientific evidence, but all of it, as well as the arguments against it, all of it can be lampooned. Not very well, but it can be, just like we can do to the other side. But then you have to go into the issue of trust. Who are who do we think is a trustworthy character or not? But the most important thing, just as one is assessing evidence, that one must do, and one must think of, especially with regard to the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin and the evidence that we have for it, like, for example, the physical and the chemical and the physics-based evidence that support its authenticity, that does not exist in a vacuum. So the skeptic will try to pinpoint all of these flaws at one by one, but they don't look at the mountain of evidence. It's like when you've got, let's just say, 100 pieces of evidence that point in one direction that something is what it purports to be.
Right.
But then each piece of evidence has a small percentage of uncertainty or, answer, or a question that's not been fully answered. If you've got that much stuff going in one direction, what are the probabilities that you could get that much stuff to support one idea? And I tell people, okay, let's just say if I made some crazy claim, I'm a unicorn, and I'm like, okay, we'll try
got a unicorn behind you there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
that's right.
Like, try to prove me wrong.
Proof, yeah.
And so let's say that somebody, that how much evidence I mean, because obviously I'm not a unicorn. So how much evidence could one just find of something as ridiculous as that?
Mm-hmm.
Because with the Shroud of Turin, it's either true or it's ridiculous to say that this is not made by human hands. It's one or the other.
Right.
And so,
yeah, because we're not. And just to be clear, like we're not debating. Like those of us who do believe it's authentic, we're kind of all in this. And not that our faith completely rides on it, but from the standpoint of we believe this is connected to this completely unrepeatable, or I should say, unmatched, sort of uncomparable kind of event, right? So it's not like we say Leonardo made it, but these guys say it was Raphael, and who's right? It's like, no, it's like we think God did this.
It's a miracle.
It's either he did it or it's not from him, and it's purely natural. It can't be. It's right. So it is a different. I feel like kind of
exactly, and it's like if people think that you can just easily come up with, I'm just making up a number, 100 pieces of evidence to go one way to heavily prove something, then, do that with me being a unicorn, or do that with my dog being a mule. See how well that goes, trying to just come up with random pieces of evidence that are compelling, that prove a point that actually isn't true.
Well, and if I may, can I another example just popped to mind. This wasn't, we weren't talking about the Shroud, but somehow like the issue of, I think, trust, fidelity, like that came up in my theology class. We were talking about the importance of this balance of, again, faith and reason. Like it's like, I think what it was is I was trying to explore with the students that faith is not what I think some people portray it as, that it's just blind acceptance of something that there's no reasonable reason to think is true, because I have, friends or some, people, acquaintances, people online who will sometimes have that attitude about my faith. Like, oh, that's cute. Like they'll pat me on the head proverbially, or, think they're respectful maybe, but it's like, they seem to misunderstand. Like I believe what I believe because I'm convinced it's true.
Yes. And because there's evidence too.
Right. And so I use the example with my students. It just popped in there. As I said, there's nothing in just sort of day-to-day life that I have more faith in than my wife's love for me and her trustworthiness. And I can point to, like, I would just exhaust myself listing all of the reasons that I have trust and faith in her. But at the end of the day, if you list them all, if you could ever do that and actually quantify that, do I know for certain, absolutely certain, that she won't lie to me, or that she won't betray me, or that she won't stab me in the, you go down the list of all these wild, crazy things. And it's like, I don't know that. I don't, it's just, it's a different kind of thing. So I don't know if that's a fair kind of comparison in a way. In that,
because
I've got a lot of reasons I think the Shroud is legit. There's people who know way more about more of the details than I do, who think it's not legitimate, or think it's legitimate even more because they know more about it. But, but the little kids who look at it and say, that's Jesus, is a very interesting kind of, thing as well to think about. Anyway, so I'm rambling a little bit. Yeah.
Oh, no, you're not. And, and one of the important things, and I find this to be the most exciting aspect of the Shroud, and that is that it is the evidence that God has given us of the falsifiable claim that Jesus made over and over and over again. And that is in the Bible, not just with one author of the gospel, in numerous gospels. And we know that Jesus said in many different ways that they are going to murder him, they're going to kill him, and that on the third day he is going to rise again. So he said this before his death.
Bodily.
That is, is a falsifiable claim.
Yeah.
And it is within that context, because what is it that we always say? Context is everything. And the Holy Shroud must be viewed and assessed in the context of that falsifiable claim. And so people will say, if I had a nickel for every time people say, oh, this is a circular argument. No, this is not a circular argument. People say, in terms, we look at the Gospels and what the Gospels say happened to Christ, and we look at the shroud evidence, and we see, just as Pope John Paul said, where it is a mirror of the Gospels. And people say, oh, that's a circular argument. No, it's not a circular argument is saying, for example, the Bible is true because it says it is true.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a circular argument because your source of information about something is coming only from that source of information. There's no corroboration. But when we take not just one gospel, the 4 gospels, and then you take in Old Testament prophecy. Wow. I mean, that just gets so amazing when
the
you
tradition
look at
of the early Christian community. And
and you see what we have on the shroud. And that's mind blowing. I mean, it's just exciting, and it is mind blowing because these are separate, because we know the Bible is not just one book written by one person. It's a compilation of books from different authors. And then when you go into, for example, the manuscript tradition and how reliable that is, especially from the New Testament. Holy mackerel.
Well, which is exactly the opposite of what I think your average person has been taught or believes. We have more manuscript evidence for the New Testament than we have for any other ancient document.
Exactly. And
thousands of times over.
People frequently want to use inconsistent standards for things that they don't want to believe in.
This unfair standard thing was interesting to me, and can I segue here into that?
Absolutely.
Just with specifically and I've seen you write about this a little bit, the chain of evidence discussion. That there's this, the shroud can't be authentic, and I may be overstating it, of course, but just to kind of put it in maybe hopefully not too much of a caricature, but a simplified version of this, the idea that if we don't have sort of an exact step-by-step chain of custody for this thing, for every accountable minute back to like 30 AD, it's not real, and again, I'm not saying those who hold to this are completely, but what is that
historical evidence that has that kind of chain of custody? None. I mean, lots of times, because we have to, again, be fair, and not be biased in our thinking. And we have to think, okay, as reasonable people, what kind of evidence is it historically that we trust? I mean, because we weren't there. History is not science. It's not a repeatable occurrence. It happened one time. And so it's really more of a forensic analysis that happens when you look into historical things. You've got to figure out what happened. You've got to see what's trustworthy. Does the evidence match up? And there are lots of things in history that we might only have one person's account for.
Right.
So, but with the Bible, with the New Testament, with the Old Testament, we've got lots of accounts of things. And when we see so many of the things, especially in the gospel, that we see evidenced on the shroud, especially the crown of thorns, that's huge, because it's obviously a crucifixion victim that we're seeing. I mean, with the nail wound in the hand / wrist area, the feet, the side wound, which we know that sometimes they would pierce the person to be sure that they were dead before removing them from the cross.
And it's the correct side.
Exactly. And
like, even if it were the other side, well,
there is only one person that is known historically, or that we know of, who a crucifixion victim that had a crown of thorns on him, and that was Christ. And that was because they were mocking him because he was the purported king of the Jews. And so there was a very precise, particularized, and unique circumstance as to why we would find all of those puncture wounds on the head. And so then people would say, oh, well, maybe something else could cause it. Well, what else would cause it? You fall in a bush of a thorny bush of holly, and no, but because the way the wounds are, it's not indicative of that.
Well, and not just that, but the thorn, like my understanding is, and if I'm wrong on this, I'm happily corrected, by someone in my YouTube comments or whatever the case is. But because I like to learn more, I often say with this, and this is not me being modest, I feel like I'm doing this only because I have come to a point where I'm very interested in this topic. And I know a little bit more than the average person on the street about it. Like that's about it. And I have all of you folks on to kind of go deeper into this. But my understanding too is the thorns are indicative of thorns from that region, which are not thorn bushes in Jerusalem are not exactly the same as thorn bushes in France or in name your other middle or your European country of potential hoaxing. Where just little details like that, it's not the same kind of thorn.
And I'll tell you, and this is where it just, the deeper you study it, it's like what Socrates says, the wiser I get, the more I realize I don't know. It is so confounding. I was doing some research on, what kind of plant created the thorns on the crown of thorns. And so the question is, it's kind of uncertain. We have some good ideas as to sorry about that.
Oh no, that's fine. My dog will probably come in any minute too. He pops in here when he gets bored. So,
but so the interesting thing is that it's not, we're not totally sure which plant it is. There, I would say 3 top contenders.
Okay.
And they're not, and they see them they're plentiful in Jerusalem, but they're not, I wouldn't say that they are exclusive.
Not exclusive,
because like one of them is Syrian Christ thorn. So, Syria has it, but it's in the region and it's plentiful in Jerusalem. And the whole crown of thorns, that I could go on that, but
that's connected to some of the pollen stuff too, which I find really, like I'll hear somebody, fair enough, like try to pick apart with the carbon dating issue, or with different folks that might be skeptical or somewhere on the skeptical range, and they'll raise some very interesting stuff. Nothing that ever really completely just blows my mind and I'm like, oh no, it's all over. Like you were saying earlier, it should drive you to want to go look into that, investigate that more. But I don't know, at least from what I've seen, I've never seen anybody like they'll lay out an argument like that, but like they won't get into the mystery of, well, how about these pollens, that are clearly from these particular regions, or what about this piece of evidence? And so that's another thing I want to ask you too, I guess along the same lines, is where is this line between, evidence and proof, and how are we using these terms maybe, or how should we maybe tweak the way that we think about evidence versus proof, especially those of us that maybe aren't coming from a legal background with this.
With evidence, you've got different standards, and for example, there's something called a scintilla of evidence, which is just a tiny little bit of evidence. That's not usually worth a whole lot. Then as you move up, you've got something called, that we use in criminal law, reasonable and articulable suspicion, which is suspicion about something that you can articulate well into words. Like, let's say the classic case in criminal law is Terry versus Ohio, where there was a young man and he kept strangely looking into a shop window, and he was basically casing the joint, as they would say.
Right.
And a police officer sees him, and he kind of recognizes that this looks a little odd, and like the guy's probably, getting ready to burglarize the place. And then he does a temporary stop just to ask him questions. He doesn't have enough information yet to do a full-on arrest, which is when somebody's arrested, you are, basically keeping them from engaging in the freedom of motion and freedom to move and do what they want. And so
it's like temporary, at least, imprisonment, kind of.
Right.
I mean,
it is, and it can be permanent,
you stop.
too.
Like, you're right.
And it
Yeah.
can be permanent. And so it breaches one's freedom of movement. And so, and that's what we call an arrest. And arrest is basically when your freedom of movement is being curtailed. So, but with what we call a Terry stop from the Terry versus Ohio case, there's not quite enough evidence with that reasonable and articulable suspicion, because there's that word, suspicion. So there's something going on to cause somebody to want to investigate further.
Right.
And so that permits a police officer to temporarily stop a person. And it's supposed to be fairly quick unless new information comes about, which causes them to have a reasonable basis to hold them longer. But then they can ask questions to either confirm or dispel their suspicions. And during that dialogue, if more information comes about, then that might bring about a higher standard of proof.
Right.
Which is what we call probable cause. Probable cause is where a reasonable person has enough evidence to think that something is probably true. So if we're going to start...
It's more likely than not.
Exactly.
Right, okay.
So that's usually going to be something where it tips over 50%.
Okay. Right. That makes sense.
It's not a slam dunk, but in terms of the probabilities, there's some, and whether it's 50% or not, but it's something that would warrant a cautious individual that's doing some due diligence to think that something has occurred. That's what's probable cause. But now, when we get to a criminal trial, then, when we're talking about somebody potentially losing their liberty or even their life, there's a much, much higher standard of proof involved. And that's where we get into the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt.
Okay.
Now, what that means is that is proof that is so overwhelming and compelling that, and it doesn't mean that it has to be 100%, because again, nothing is 100%.
Right.
But it means that it's so overwhelming that a reasonable mind can rest easily in the conclusion that they are arriving at.
Sure.
Not that there is no doubt, but there is no reasonable doubt. And that's the kicker, reasonable doubt. And so, and I've said this over and over again, I believe that the Shroud of Turin has been proven authentic already, just even with the evidence that we have beyond a reasonable doubt. What's that standard look like in terms of percentage? I put it at, about 96, 97% confidence about something. And I'll tell you, my mind rests very, very easily in terms of its authenticity. To know the evidence very, very well is, I believe, to know it's authentic. Now, why would some people not want it to be authentic? Why would some people want to put a different standard of proof onto something like the Shroud of Turin that they don't apply to their everyday pieces of history or news that they believe? For example, you hear things on the news, and it might be something big like, oh, there's a bank robber that's on the loose and he's armed and dangerous. Stay in your house. Don't go anywhere. Lockdown, whatever. Well, how much evidence do we have that that's true? It's probably just one person who said it. You probably don't even know who said it. You don't know if they're credible. You just heard it. Or you hear somebody running down the neighborhood saying, a tornado's coming. Well, I don't know that neighbor, and they just moved to the neighborhood. And how do I know if that's true? But you know what? Especially if it's something big enough, then you might not want to have your first presumption be that they're lying, because, and that gets you into something that's also important, Pascal's wager. And, and remind me about that, because that's really important too. But in terms of, just to finish the thought, one of the reasons that I think that people, and I think it's the reason why people hold something like the Shroud of Turin to a different standard, it's because of a thinking error. And that thinking error is bias. And that error is because if the Shroud of Turin is authentic, there's a lot that follows from that, and it's pretty big, and it's rather life-altering, because if it is authentic, if the Shroud of Turin through science, people say, oh, science can't prove God. I say, oh, really? Because no, God is not something that can be repeated in a laboratory. But part of what scientists do is they figure things out through the process of elimination. And if you can, through science, eliminate all of the reasonable mechanisms or purported or mechanisms in terms of how the Shroud of Turin might have been created, then what does that leave? That leaves us with what philosopher and atheist David Hume said. He was talking about how in order to prove a miracle, you have to show basically that the explanation for it being a miracle makes more sense than any of the other natural explanations. And I believe that that is precisely what we have with the Shroud of Turin. It meets that extremely stringent, high, pretty much impossible standard, or almost impossible except through God, standard that David Hume met. And it meets it because nobody has been able to figure out how to reproduce the body image on this cloth. And I am really focused on the bloodstains, and more as I look at what we see. I mean, I haven't come to any conclusions yet, but I'm telling you, there is so much that is so complex about the bloodstains, because they're not, we can show that it's not just blood that has been painted onto the shroud. That is a different, these are transfers of blood clots. But how would you remove the body from the cross? Or if you washed the body at the tomb or cleansed it, how did you get that cloth on it with no smears? How are there no smears on this cloth? It's mind blowing when you think about it, like blow by blow. I don't know. I'm like I said, I haven't come to any conclusions.
Yeah, I'd like to look into that more. Yeah,
I'm starting to think that it's possible, very, very possible, that the bloodstains that we see, not that they didn't touch a human body, because we have this amazing experiment that was done by Dr. Gilbert Lavoy, which we know that the image making, which was done, knowledge from other people, we know that the image making was more of like a frontal projection type thing, because you don't see the sides of the body. But we know from Dr. Lavoy's experiment that the bloodstains that people think are in the hair on the sides of the face, you see these bloodstains. People think it's in the hair. It's not in the hair. What he did was he got some linen cloth. He overlaid it onto an image of the shroud and cut out holes where all the bloodstains were on the head. And then he put the cloth over somebody and I guess painted, red marks wherever the holes were.
Yeah.
And you know where those side bloodstains are? They're on the side of the face. So it's not in the hair. It's on the side of the face, which tells us...
I'm looking at it up here. Yeah.
Yes, and that's just additional evidence that the bloodstains came through some sort of a contact process with the body, like a three-dimensional contact process. But anyway, it's super complex. It's not as simple as people think. But my point is that when you look at the shroud, there are just so many pieces of evidence that come together and that are just unexplainable, and nobody's been able to reproduce these. And
certainly
so
not all like together.
You're right. And I even kind of question some of the things that people claim that have been reproduced, which most of the things I can't really recall anything that has been perfectly reproduced. A lot of times they'll come close, but again, no cigar. So all of that points to this cloth having supernatural aspects to it, which makes perfect sense.
You'd expect that if it's real.
It mirrors because it mirrors what Christ is. Christ, the divine. He is God incarnate. He was both human and divine simultaneously, in the same way that the shroud is both physical and has metaphysical and supernatural,
inexplicable aspects
to it. Wow. And so, but so when people, when a person comes to realize that the shroud is authentic, and that means what? That the Christian God is real. Now, one of the things about the Christian God being real is there are a bunch of rules that come with that. And that means that heaven is real, and that means that hell is real. And what hell is precisely, it's uncertain. We don't know if some of the very scary language, if it's just figurative language, is there a lake of fire? I don't know, but I really don't want to find out firsthand either. And it's not about just, fire insurance. I mean, there are much bigger and better reasons to be a Christian than that. Yeah. But part of it too is a big part of being a Christian is not only glorifying God, but we must bend the knee. We must be obedient to the best of our abilities. And we will all fail because we are all sinners and we're all imperfect. So none of us are capable of the perfection that God would like for us to have.
Right.
But it's obedience. And what does obedience mean? It means doing a lot of things, or it means not doing a lot of things that many people consider to be very fun and pleasurable, and they don't want to stop doing. So what do they do with their bias, which is, again, a thinking error? Instead of looking at things with calm, cool rationality in terms of assessing the evidence, they're thinking, I don't want God to be real.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to be afraid of going to hell. So it's easier to just, oh, God's not real. That's just a fairy tale. Because I don't want to stop doing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And so I'm just going to turn a blind eye and just wave it off. You're a bunch of kooks, whatever. It's because they don't want it to be true. And they're being like a 2-year-old say, no, this isn't right. This isn't right. And it's like, I think that a lot of these people are, not all, but many, they don't want it to be true. Because they don't want to then try to...
Maybe more is at stake for them in the sense of... Like, I think this came up in the last interview. I think one of the last interviews we were talking about this a little bit in the sense that, if the shroud were 100% definitively proven beyond the shadow of a doubt tomorrow to be fake, I would be disappointed. I'd have to, think about some stuff, but like it wouldn't sink my faith at all, honestly. However, if it's proven 100% beyond the shadow of a doubt to be the authentic burial cloth of Jesus, and it's connected to a miracle and the resurrection, that is something I try to take into account in my own sort of, just dialogue maybe with folks, my own maybe hopefully Christian compassion and recognition that this is actually, I think, in some ways harder for someone who is on the sort of other side of it, this issue, because like you said, if it is true, there's potentially more that might have to be addressed and changed about the life than for me.
The more certain or the more confident that one can be that God is real and that heaven is real and that hell is real, that has huge implications on our behavior. Mm-hmm. And it's very easy to disregard rules if the rule maker is just sort of this vague, nebulous concept. Mm-hmm. For example, I find that I've seen with a lot of atheists and some agnostics too, that they just cannot, they don't want the Christian God to be real because their concept of God is not what they read in the Bible. They have problems. It's like political correctness has invaded their thinking to where it's like, if God is not politically correct, well, God, that's a nebulous thing. Politics and political pressures among your peers, among your boss, among everybody, that's real. And many times it can be very much so in your face. Yeah. And so,
very
it's like,
compelling or
exactly.
Pressure.
And so when it comes to standing up against things where it might not be politically correct to do that, it's easier to just do the politically correct thing because you see the pressure and you feel the immediate pressure, as opposed to, well, okay, I believe in God, or maybe God exists, but out there in the ether, and it's not in your face. And so it's easier to just kind of push that to the side. But when you have something like the shroud that is in your face, and that evidence is in your face, and you realize that this is proof beyond a reasonable doubt that God is real, that has a whole different effect on not just your worldview, but on your own behavior. And a lot of people don't want, who wants restrictions? Nobody wants restrictions, but God is God, and
well, just like the little kids don't want the my 2-year-old doesn't want the restriction of the fence around the playground, but like I'm glad it's there because there's a highway next to it, or so.
Exactly.
It's like
right.
Well, Teddy, I feel like we're just getting started, but I'm gonna have to get going here. I'm afraid in a minute the girls. I hear the girls are back and they need lunch. So that's funny. I feel like half of these interviews are me. I have to go to make dinner or lunch, which is a great thing. But I just want to ask you, maybe in our just closing just couple of minutes here, if just, for now, at least, maybe any just final thoughts or recommendations for people if they're maybe not so sure where they stand on all of this, or that they're trying, like we've been saying throughout, trying to weigh evidence, just maybe some closing advice for them as they move forward, looking at different articles and blog posts. And like I said, I've posted below some an example or two of just some discussions you've had too with some of our friends who may be on different, like sort of the scale here, so to speak, different sides of this. So just any thoughts on that for now?
Yes. I find that the most compelling evidence, if you're just going to focus in on one thing, the most compelling evidence of the Shroud's authenticity, it's not the easiest to read. It's not the easiest to understand, but I'm not a scientist, but I've put in the effort. And if you really want to know, the truth, and if you really want to get into what will give you the most compelling arguments of its authenticity, look into the chemistry of it, but also some of the physics-based tests. But look into the work of Dr. Alan Adler, who was a blood specialist who specialized in porphyrins, which that's in hemoglobin, which is in blood, and that was found on the Shroud. So where the microscopist Walter McCrone had said, there is no blood on the Shroud. Well, and he was saying that it was all iron oxide and vermilion. Well, then how'd you get porphyrins and hemoglobin? And there were 12 different tests that were passed that show that blood is in fact on the Shroud. And he tries to say that the body image was iron oxide too. And that's false, because when they did through the X-ray fluorescent tests, there was not an increase in the iron content from the background, because the background of the cloth has iron on it from the retting process, iron and calcium and strontium. That's when they make linen from flax, they put flax in water and it attracts iron and calcium and strontium from the water. So they could tell that there was iron, calcium, and strontium just uniformly distributed, relatively speaking, throughout the whole Shroud, 14 by 3 feet. When you go from the background of the cloth to the body image, there's no increase in the iron levels, except for when you get to the blood stains, which of course blood contains iron. And so that accounts
in other words,
for
that's
the higher
what you would
level.
expect.
Exactly. But
if it's authentic,
exactly. But if the body image were made from iron oxide paint, it's not even the right color for iron oxide, red ochre pigment, which is what McCrone said. But anyway, I digress. But one of my favorite books, which gives you a firsthand account, and it goes into all of this juicy background, it's Dr. John Heller's book, Report on the Shroud of Turin. That's what it's called. My book is just completely falling apart because I use it so much. And there's so many details, and you will see the obsessive, compulsive brilliance of both Drs. Heller and Adler as they worked together on the chemistry and the microchemistry of the Shroud. And that just, in my opinion, runs circles around all of the other evidence. It's just so amazing.
I'll have to link. I'll link that below.
And it's like, and it's actually it's out of print, but you can buy it on eBay. I've bought several copies and given some away, but a lot of times you can buy it for maybe $7-8 on eBay.
Sure.
And, but it's also very easy to read. Generally speaking, it's almost like and it's got funny parts too, but it's by far my favorite book on the Shroud, and it's been the most useful to me because it's a firsthand account of the details of the testing done by the person one of the two people that was part of the team that was doing the testing. So that's, and again, when you're talking about like in a courtroom, the most important thing is firsthand evidence, that comes from the person who did it and who saw it. And that you don't get, that's the gold standard. So,
Sure.
But, another thing just real quick is Pascal's wager. And so people, I encourage people to think in terms of, with Pascal's wager, how, whether you make the gamble or not, whether you're making the gamble, whether you think you are or not, because if you just discard God, then you're basically gambling that God doesn't exist. Right. And if you're wrong, well, there's hell to pay.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
And if it turns out that God doesn't exist, well, the rules that God has put into effect for us to follow, those are pretty good rules. And a lot of times when people fly afoul of those
lead to
rules,
human flourishing.
They have a lot of problems in their lives. So anyway, I just wanted to leave you with that, but it's been a real pleasure talking with you.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine, Teddi. This has just been wonderful. I'd love to have you back on, because I just said to, I think I was talking to Bob Rucker a while back and said, it's funny. I said, I never planned any of this. And, 2022, we're recording this. This is going to air probably the first week here of 2023 when people are seeing this. But I just laughed. I said, 2022 and a good chunk of 2021 led to a lot of these somewhat regular Shroud interviews and discussions. And I said, it's funny. I've only had, I don't know if you know Martha May at all, but I've had Martha on twice. I had early on, talking about different stuff in the wounds of Jesus was the last one.
I'll have to listen to the podcast.
Yeah. Oh, it was great. And she had some great, I'll send you the link later. She had some good props stuff too. Got a lot of good reviews. People really like that one. But I was laughing though, because I said, other than her, I haven't had anybody back on yet. So it's just been this, pretty awesome continual stream of folks approaching it from all kind of different angles but I'd be so overjoyed to have any and everyone back on. So,
well,
so we'll stay
let
tuned
me know,
in the future.
And I'd be happy to come back. I'd be honored to. Thank you.
Well, God bless you so much. Thank you.
God bless you too.
Yep. Delightful. Really intriguing conversation, really insightful. And as always, it opened up a bunch of new avenues and different topics and different things that we want to pursue in the future on this channel. So Teddi and I are already talking about having her back on the show. So definitely keep an eye out for that in the future, as well as other guests that I'm going to have back on to talk about different elements of the Shroud of Turin, as I continue to grow more in my awareness and knowledge of this topic, ways to and maybe ways not to potentially approach the question of the Shroud's authenticity and its role in the lives of so many people. So I'm certainly, like I said, I'm no expert. I'm learning with all of you. I'm delighted to share this with you, and so happy that you have all responded so positively to this content. But I want to ask you too, if you would be so kind, feel free to share with me on my website. Go to thegraciousguest.org. Share with me through there or in the comments, however you want to do that. Other topic ideas, guest ideas, Shroud or not. I'm very interested in approaching a lot of different topics. From really literature to miracle stories to I'm going to hopefully do a series pretty soon on the Camino de Santiago, have some people on who have been on that very ancient pilgrimage across northern Spain, and so The Gracious Guest is a place where there's all kinds of topics and interesting conversations and explorations of all things wonder and awe. I'm glad you stopped by today, and until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.